Chapter 12 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Compensated Abolishment. The annual message of President Lincoln at the opening of Congress in December 1861 treated many subjects of importance: foreign relations, the condition of the finances, a reorganization of the Supreme Court, questions of military administration, the building of a military railroad through Kentucky to East Tennessee, the newly organized territories, a review of military progress towards the suppression of rebellion. It contained also a vigorous practical discussion of the relations between capital and labor, which pointed out with singular force that the insurrection is largely, if not exclusively, a war upon the first principle of popular government, the rights of the people. In addition to these topics, it treated another question of greater importance than all of them, but in so moderate a tone, and with such tentative suggestions, that it excited less immediate comment than any other. This was the question of slavery. It had not escaped Mr. Lincoln's notice that the relations of slavery to the war were producing rapidly increasing complications and molding public thought to new and radical changes of opinion. His revocation of Fremont's proclamation had momentarily checked the clamor of importunate agitators for military emancipation, but he saw clearly enough that a deep, though as yet undefined, public hope clung to the vague suggestion that slavery and rebellion might perish together. As a significant symptom of this undercurrent of feeling, there came to him in November a letter from George Bancroft, the veteran Democratic politician and national historian, a man eminent not only for his writings upon the science of government, but who, as a member of President Polk's cabinet, had rendered signal and lasting service in national administration. Mr. Bancroft had lately presided at a meeting in New York called to collect contributions to aid the suffering loyalists of North Carolina. As it happened on all such occasions, the patriotism of the hour sprang forward to bold speech and radical argument. Even the moderate words of Mr. Bancroft on taking the chair reflected this reformatory spirit. If slavery and the Union are incompatible, listen to the words that come to you from the tomb of Andrew Jackson. The Union must be preserved at all hazards. If anyone claims the compromises of the Constitution, let him begin by placing the Constitution in power by respecting it and upholding it. In the letter transmitting these remarks and the resolutions of the meeting to Mr. Lincoln, Mr. Bancroft made a yet more emphatic suggestion. He wrote, "Your administration has fallen upon times which will be remembered as long as human events find a record. I sincerely wish to you the glory of perfect success. Civil war is the instrument of divine providence to root out social slavery. Posterity will not be satisfied with the result unless the consequences of the war shall effect an increase of free states. This is the universal expectation and hope of men of all parties." Such a letter from a man having the learning, talent, and political standing of its author is of itself historic, but Mr. Lincoln's reply gives it a special significance. November 18, 1861, he wrote, "I esteem it a high honor to have received a note from Mr. Bancroft enclosing the report of proceedings of a New York meeting taking measures for the relief of Union people of North Carolina. I thank you and all others participating for this benevolent and patriotic movement. The main thought in the closing paragraph of your letter is one which does not escape my attention, and with which I must deal in all due caution and with the best judgment I can bring to it. This language gives us the exact condition of Mr. Lincoln's mind on the subject of slavery at that time. He hoped and expected to effect an increase of free States through emancipation, but we shall see that this emancipation was to come through the voluntary action of the States, and that he desired by such policy to render unnecessary the compulsory military enfranchisement which Fremont had attempted and which his followers advocated. The caution and good judgment which President Lincoln applied to the solution of this dangerous problem become manifest when we re-examine its treatment in his annual message mentioned above. Not referring directly to any general plan or hope of emancipation, he nevertheless approached the subject by discussing its immediate and practical necessities in phraseology which gave him room for expansion into a more decisive policy. It is worth while not merely to quote the whole passage, but to emphasize the sentences which were plainly designed to lead Congress and the country to the contemplation of new and possible contingencies. Under and by virtue of the act of Congress entitled "An Act to Confiscate Property Used for Insurrectionary Purposes," approved August 6, 1861, the legal claims of certain persons to the labor and service of certain other persons have become forfeited, and numbers of the latter, thus liberated, are already dependent on the United States and must be provided for in some way. Besides this, it is not impossible that some of the States will pass similar enactments for their own benefit respectively, and by operation of which persons of the same class will be thrown upon them for disposal. In such case, I recommend that Congress provide for accepting such persons from such States, according to some mode of valuation, in lieu pro tanto of direct taxes, or upon some other plan to be agreed on with such States respectively, that such persons, on such acceptance by the General Government, be at once deemed free, and that in any event steps be taken for colonizing both classes, or the one first mentioned, if the other shall not be brought into existence, at some place or places in a climate congenial to them. It might be well to consider, too, whether the free colored people already in the United States could not, so far as individuals may desire, be included in such colonization. The war continues. In considering the policy to be adopted for suppressing the insurrection, I have been anxious and careful that the inevitable conflict for this purpose shall not degenerate into a violent and remorseless revolutionary struggle. I have therefore in every case thought it proper to keep the integrity of the Union prominent as the primary object of the contest on our part, leaving all questions which are not of vital military importance to the more deliberate action of the Legislature. In the exercise of my best discretion, I have adhered to the blockade of the ports held by the insurgents, instead of putting in force by proclamation the law of Congress enacted at the late session for closing those ports. So also, obeying the dictates of prudence, as well as the obligations of law, instead of transcending, I have adhered to the act of Congress to confiscate property used for insurrectionary purposes. If a new law upon the same subject shall be proposed, its propriety will be duly considered. The Union must be preserved, and hence all indispensable means must be employed. We should not be in haste to determine that radical and extreme measures, which may reach the loyal as well as the disloyal, are indispensable. Apparently, these propositions covered the simple recommendation of colonization, an old and familiar topic which had friends in both free and slave states. But the language, when closely scanned, is full of novel suggestions that the war has already freed many slaves, that the war may free many more, that the President will impartially consider any new law of Congress increasing emancipation for rebellion, that he will not hastily adopt extreme measures, but that finally, to preserve the Union, all indispensable means must be employed. These declarations, in fact, cover the whole of his subsequent treatment of the slavery question. Congress was too busy with pressing practical legislation to find time for immediately elaborating by debate or enactment any of the recommendations thus made. It is not likely that the President expected early action from the national legislature, for he at once turned his own attention to certain initiatory efforts which he had probably carefully meditated. He believed that under the pressure of war necessities, the border slave States might be induced to take up the idea of voluntary emancipation if the General Government would pay their citizens the full property value of the slaves they were asked to liberate. And this experiment seemed to him most feasible in the small State of Delaware, which retained only the merest fragment of a property interest in the peculiar institution. Owing to the division of its voters between Breckinridge, Bell, Lincoln, and Douglas, the electoral vote of Delaware had been cast for Breckinridge in the presidential election of 1860. But more adroit party management had succeeded in effecting a fusion of the Bell and Lincoln vote for member of Congress, and George P. Fisher had been elected by a small majority. It is of little importance to know the exact shade of Mr. Fisher's politics during the campaign. When the rebellion broke out, he was an ardent Unionist, a steadfast friend of Mr. Lincoln, and perhaps more liberal on the subject of slavery than any other border State representative. He entered readily into Mr. Lincoln's views and plans, which were to induce the legislature of Delaware to pass an act of gradual emancipation of the 1,798 slaves which it contained by the census of 1860, on condition that the United States will pay to Delaware, to be distributed among its slave owners in proper ratio, the sum of $400 for each slave, or a total of $719,200. Mr. Lincoln, during the month of November, had with his own hand written drafts of two separate bills embracing the principal details of the scheme. By the first, all Negroes in Delaware above the age of 35 years should become free on the passage of the act. All born after its passage should remain free, and all others, after suitable apprenticeship for children, should become free in the year 1893. Also, that the State should meanwhile prevent any of its slaves being sold into servitude elsewhere. The provisions of the second draft were slightly different. Lincoln's manuscript explains, "On reflection, I like number 2 the better. By it the nation would pay the State $23,200 per annum for 31 years. All born after the passage of the act would be born free. All slaves above the age of 35 years would become free on the passage of the act. All others would become free on arriving at the age of 35 years until January 1893, when all remaining of all ages would become free, subject to apprenticeship for minors born of slave mothers up to the respective ages of 21 and 18. Upon consultation with the President, Mr. Fisher undertook to propose and commend the scheme to his influential party friends in Delaware, and, if possible, to induce the legislature of that State to adopt it. One of the drafts prepared by Mr. Lincoln was rewritten by the friends of the measure in Delaware, embodying the necessary details to give it proper force and local application to become a law of that State. In this shape it was printed and circulated among the members of the legislature, then holding a special session at Dover. The legislature of Delaware was not a large body. 9 members of the Senate and 21 members of the House constituted the whole number. We have no record of the discussions, formal or informal, which the proposition called forth. The final action, however, indicates the sentiment which prevailed. The friends of emancipation probably ascertained that a hostile majority would vote it down. Therefore, the laboriously prepared bill was never introduced. The pro-slavery members, unwilling to lose the opportunity of airing their conservatism, immediately prepared a joint resolution reciting the bill at full length, and then loading it with the strongest phrases of condemnation which their party's zeal could invent. They said it would encourage the abolition element in Congress, that it evinced a design to abolish slavery in the States, that Congress had no right to appropriate $1 for the purchase of slaves, that they were unwilling to make Delaware guarantee the public faith of the United States, that when the people of Delaware desired to abolish slavery within her borders, they would do so in their way, and intimated that the suggestions of saving expense to the people were a bribe, which they scornfully repelled. A majority of the 21 members of the House passed this joint resolution, but when it came to the Senate on the 7th of February, 4 of its 9 members voted aye, 4 voted no, and 1 was silent or absent, and so the joint resolution went back non-concurred in. This seems to have closed the legislative record on the subject. Mr. Lincoln was doubtless disappointed at the failure to give his plan of compensated gradual abolishment a starting point by the favorable action of the State of Delaware. But he did not abandon the project, and his next step was to bring it through Congress to the attention of the country and the States interested. On the 6th of March, he sent to the Senate and the House of Representatives a special message recommending the adoption of the following joint resolution: Resolved, that the United States ought to cooperate with any State which may adopt gradual abolishment of slavery, giving to such State pecuniary aid to be used by such State in its discretion to compensate for the inconveniences, public and private, produced by such change of system. His message explained that this was merely the proposal of practical measures which he hoped would follow. He said, "The point is not that all the States tolerating slavery would very soon, if at all, initiate emancipation, but that while the offer is equally made to all, the more Northern shall by such initiation make it certain to the more Southern that in no event will the former ever join the latter in their proposed confederacy. I say initiation because, in my judgment, gradual and not sudden emancipation is better for all. Such a proposition on the part of the General Government sets up no claim of a right by Federal authority to interfere with slavery within State limits, referring as it does the absolute control of the subject in each case to the State and its people immediately interested. It is proposed as a matter of perfectly free choice with them. In the annual message last December, I thought fit to say, the Union must be preserved, and hence all indispensable means must be employed. I said this not hastily, but deliberately. War has been made and continues to be an indispensable means to this end. A practical re-acknowledgment of the national authority would render the war unnecessary, and it would at once cease. If, however, resistance continues, the war must also continue, and it is impossible to foresee all the incidents which may attend and all the ruin which may follow it. Such as may seem indispensable or may obviously promise great efficiency towards ending the struggle must and will come. To this public recommendation he added some cogent reasons in private letters to influential persons. Thus, 3 days after his message, he wrote to the editor of the New York Times, "I am grateful to the New York journals, and not less so to the Times than to others, for their kind notices of the late special message to Congress. Your paper, however, intimates that the proposition, though well intentioned, must fail on the score of expense. I do hope you will reconsider this. Have you noticed the facts that less than 1/2 day's cost of this war would pay for all the slaves in Delaware at $400 per head? That 87 days' cost of this war would pay for all in Delaware, Maryland, District of Columbia, Kentucky, and Missouri at the same price? Were those States to take the step, do you doubt that it would shorten the war more than 87 days and thus be an actual saving of expense? Please look at these things and consider whether there should not be another article in the Times. So again to Senator McDougall, who was opposing the scheme with considerable earnestness in the Senate, he wrote privately on March 14. As to the expensiveness of the plan of gradual emancipation with compensation proposed in the late message, please allow me one or two brief suggestions. Less than one-half day's cost of this war would pay for all the slaves in Delaware at $400 per head. Thus, all the slaves in Delaware by the census of 1860 are 1,798 times $400. The cost of the slave, $719,200. 1 day's cost of the war, $2 million. Again, less than 87 days' cost of this war would, at the same price, pay for all in Delaware, Maryland, District of Columbia, Kentucky, and Missouri. Thus, slaves in Delaware, 1,798. Slaves in Maryland, 87,188. Slaves in District of Columbia, 3,181. Slaves in Kentucky, 225,490. Slaves in Missouri, 114,965. Total, 432,622 times $400. Cost of slaves, $173,048,800. 87 days cost of the war, $174 million. Do you doubt that taking the initiatory steps on the part of those States in this district would shorten the war more than 87 days and thus be an actual saving of expense? A word as to the time and manner of incurring the expense. Suppose, for instance, a State devises and adopts a system by which the institution absolutely ceases therein by a named day, say January 1, 1882. Then let the sum to be paid to such State by the United States be ascertained by taking from the census of 1860 the number of slaves within the State and multiplying that number by 400. The United States to pay such sum to the State in 20 equal annual installments in 6% bonds of the United States. The sum thus given, as to time and manner, I think would not be half as onerous as would be an equal sum raised now for the indefinite prosecution of the war, but of this you can judge as well as I. It was between the dates of these letters that President Lincoln made the most important personal effort to secure favorable action on his project of gradual abolishment. At his request, such members of Congress from the border slave States of Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri, as were present in Washington, came in a body to the Executive Mansion on March 10, where a somewhat prolonged discussion of this subject ensued, the substance of which was authentically reported by them. In reading the account of the interview, it must be remembered that Lincoln was addressing the representatives of such slave States as had remained loyal, and his phrases respecting his attitude and intention towards slavery were not intended by him to apply to the States whose persistent rebellion had forfeited the consideration and rights which the others could justly claim. Mr. Crisfield thus relates the substance of the President's address. After the usual salutations, and we were seated, the President said in substance that he had invited us to meet him to have some conversation with us in explanation of his message of the 6th; that since he had sent it in, several of the gentlemen then present had visited him, but had avoided any allusion to the message, and he therefore inferred that the import of the message had been misunderstood, and was regarded as inimical to the interests we represented, and he had resolved he would talk with us and disabuse our minds of that erroneous opinion. The President then disclaimed any intent to injure the interests or wound the sensibilities of the slave States. On the contrary, his purpose was to protect the one and respect the other. That we were engaged in a terrible, wasting, and tedious war. Immense armies were in the field and must continue in the field as long as the war lasts. That these armies must of necessity be brought into contact with slaves in the States we represented, and in other States as they advanced. That slaves would come to the camps, and continual irritation was kept up. That he was constantly annoyed by conflicting and antagonistic complaints. On the one side, a certain class complained if the slave was not protected by the army. Persons were frequently found who, participating in these views, acted in a way unfriendly to the slaveholder. On the other hand, slaveholders complained that their rights were interfered with, their slaves induced to abscond and protected within the lines. These complaints were numerous, loud, and deep, were a serious annoyance to him, and embarrassing to the progress of the war. That it kept alive a spirit hostile to the Government in the States we represented, strengthened the hopes of the Confederates that at some day the border States would unite with them and thus tend to prolong the war. And he was of the opinion, if this resolution should be adopted by Congress and accepted by our States, these causes of irritation and these hopes would be removed, and more would be accomplished towards shortening the war than could be hoped from the greatest victory achieved by Union armies. That he made this proposition in good faith, and desired it to be accepted, if at all, voluntarily, and in the same patriotic spirit in which it was made. That emancipation was a subject exclusively under the control of the States, and must be adopted or rejected by each for itself. That he did not claim, nor had this Government any right to coerce them for that purpose. That such was no part of his purpose in making this proposition, and he wished it to be clearly understood. That he did not expect us there to be prepared to give him an answer, but he hoped we would take the subject into serious consideration, confer with one another, and then take such course as we felt our duty and the interests of our constituents required of us. It is not to be wondered at that his auditors were unable to give him affirmative replies or even remote encouragement. Representing slave-holding constituencies, their natural attitude was one of unyielding conservatism. Their whole tone was one of doubt, of qualified protest, and of apprehensive inquiry. They had not failed to note that in his annual message of December 3 and his special message of March 6 he had announced his determination to use all indispensable means to preserve the Union, and had hinted that necessity might force him to employ extreme measures, and one of them asked pointedly if the President looked to any policy beyond the acceptance or rejection of this scheme. His answer was frank and direct. Mr. Crisfield of Maryland writes, "The President replied that he had no designs beyond the action of the States on this particular subject. He should lament their refusal to accept it, but he had no designs beyond their refusal of it. Unless he was expelled by the act of God or the Confederate armies, he should occupy that house for 3 years, and as long as he remained there, Maryland had nothing to fear, either for her institutions or her interests on the points referred to." The day on which this interview was held, Roscoe Conkling introduced into the House of Representatives the exact joint resolution which the President had recommended in his message of the 6th, and debate on the subject was begun. The discussion showed a wide divergence of views among Representatives. Moderate Republicans generally supported the resolution. Even pronounced anti-slavery men, such as Lovejoy in the House and Sumner in the Senate, indicated their willingness to join in the liberal compensation the President had proposed, if the loyal slave States would consent to relinquish their portion of the disturbing and dangerous evil. Since it was not a practical measure, but simply an announcement of policy, the opposition was not strenuous. A few border State representatives and the more obstinate Democrats from free States joined in a somewhat ill-natured dissent. The resolution was passed on the following day, yeas 89, nays 31. The action of the Senate was very similar, though the debate was a little more delayed. The resolution was passed in that body April 2, yeas 32, nays 10, and received the President's signature on the 10th of April, 1862. By his initiative and influence, Mr. Lincoln thus committed the executive and legislative departments of the government to the policy of compensated emancipation, and there is no doubt that, had his generous offer been accepted by the border States within a reasonable time, the pledge embodied in the joint resolution would have been promptly redeemed. Though it afterwards turned out that this action remained only sentimental and prospective, it nevertheless had no inconsiderable effect in bringing to pass a very important practical measure. In its long contest for political supremacy, slavery had clung with unyielding tenacity to its foothold in the District of Columbia, where it had been the most irritating eyesore to Northern opinion. Whatever might be conceded to the doctrine of State sovereignty, anti-slavery men felt that the peculiar institution had no claim to the exclusive shelter of the Federal flag. On the other hand, pro-slavery men saw that to relinquish this claim would be fatal to their determination to push it to national recognition. Hence the abolition or the maintenance of slavery in the District of Columbia had become a frequent issue in party politics. The prohibition of the slave trade in the district was indeed effected in the Great Compromise of 1850, but this concession was more than counterbalanced by the pro-slavery gains of that political bargain, and since then the abolition of slavery itself in this central Federal jurisdiction seemed to have become impossible until rebellion provoked the change. Under the new conditions, anti-slavery zeal was pushing its lance into every joint of the monster's armor, and this vulnerable point was not overlooked. The Constitution placed the District of Columbia exclusively under the legislation of Congress, and by their rebellious withdrawal from their seats in the two houses, the Southern senators and representatives had voluntarily surrendered this citadel of their propagandism. President Lincoln had not specifically recommended abolishment in the district in his annual message, but he had introduced a bill for such a purpose when he was a member of Congress in 1849. And it was well known that his views had undergone no change. Later on, the already recited special message of March 6 embraced the subject in its larger aspects and recommendations. Thus, with perfect knowledge that it would receive executive sanction, the Senate on April 3, yeas 29, nays 14, and the House on April 11, yeas 92, nays 38, passed an act of immediate emancipation of the slaves in the District of Columbia, with compensation to the owners to be distributed by a commission, the whole not to exceed an aggregate of $300 per slave. The act also appropriated the sum of $100,000 for expenses of voluntary emigration to Haiti or Liberia. President Lincoln signed the act on the 16th of April, and in his short message of approval said, "I have never doubted the constitutional authority of Congress to abolish slavery in this district, and I have ever desired to see the national capital freed from the institution in some satisfactory way. Hence there has never been in my mind any question upon the subject except the one of expediency, arising in view of all the circumstances. I am gratified that the two principles of compensation and colonization are both recognized and practically applied in the act." Certain omissions in the law, which the President pointed out, were remedied by supplementary enactments, which, among other provisions, added to the boon of freedom the privilege of education by opening public schools to colored children. End of chapter 12.